have Nate and Dave, right, from Development Seed here with us today to talk about their work, and I think you'll discuss some recent projects.
Yes, we're going to discuss a little bit of some recent work, some ideas that we've been thinking about and kicking around, and what we'll do is just walk through that, talk a little bit about the projects, some of our approach, and then talk a little bit about tools, and then open up for questions and discussion. So, but we'll do a quick introduction. I'm Nate, and brought Dave along as well. Just that we both kind of wear a lot of hats at Development Seed, both doing a lot of data work, both doing a lot of strategy. We do a little design, a little bit of development. We do a lot of things, and so it'll be. We're open for any type of questions, whether it's more on the strategy side of things, approach, to getting into the nitty-gritty of tools and how things are built or how data is working. So let me, I'll give you a little quick background on Development Seed. Some of you guys are deeply familiar with some of the previous projects that we've done with Info Amazonia or the Afghanistan team, and so we'll touch a little bit about that, but then we're going to talk a little bit more about some new projects. And for those that aren't familiar with Development Seed, we're a small tech team that really does custom tools for data and maps, and that's kind of our focus around making data a little bit more usable, experimenting how we publish data with maps, how do you use data, and making it really kind of experimenting with how you make data more open and more useful. Not just like putting things on the web to share it, but putting it with a reason, with a purpose, and trying to make something, something like data a lot more easily understood, more connected to programs and operations, or more connected to what you or anyone else is thinking about wanting to try and solve. So, if you imagine everyone's fairly familiar with this project in Afghanistan with NAI and Afghan country team looking at violence against journalists in Afghanistan. And so this is a great project around the simplicity of a data collection tool, just a Google spreadsheet, can then be turned into a single-page website that really helps focus a message around what's happening, where is it happening, and getting a sense of the data being collected. Another project is Lily in Info Amazonia, and this was basically what we did was the first iteration, and it's grown since then in the last couple of years, which is awesome to see that the beginnings of combining data, maps, and geolocating news stories, and having this platform for putting more news and putting news into this context within both the location and what is the data, the story around what's happening. Some other projects that we've been working on recently have been open.undp.org, which is a massive project browser for UNDP, sharing all their 6,000 projects, development projects that they do. And so it's a really fast browser for someone to dive in, filter by country, look at what are they focusing on, how are they breaking down their numbers on a yearly basis, and get a sense of what's basically their financial transparency, and it allows donors, allows anyone working with the UNDP to understand what's happening and where. We've also done some work around data sharing in the Sahel with World Bank and a bunch of other partners, and standing up a quick data portal to share, not only share data in an easy manner, but also narrate a little bit of the story. So kind of focusing a little bit on the advocacy message of creating a portal allows someone to dive in and understand both the message and then have the ability to explore. And then we've also done some work with ground truths and Mekilnan and Tandale around helping kind of visualize on-the-ground work, so doing mapping through OpenStreetMap and really putting a slum on the map. But this work, we work with them to help kind of visualize that change. So this site really allows you to see the before and after of that work. And so it's a little bit of a storytelling site, showing how what the significance of a coordinated on-the-ground effort can do to bring a community, put the community on the map, and really help focus that idea that creating data really can strengthen how you're looking at the community. But so that's a little bit about what we've done in the past. But I want to take a little bit further step back and talk a little bit about Afghanistan elections. We're in kind of elections mode. I don't know if anyone else is in. Like what you guys are. I know you guys are doing some work in Afghanistan around the election. So we've been working on this for the past couple of weeks, where and so this is like on the forefront of our mind. That's why what I kind of thought we would talk about today and show some of our latest work that we've been doing and some of the approaches that we've been talking about. But before we dive into the new stuff, let's talk about the old stuff, which is this is the 2009 presidential election site that the National Democratic Institute put online. We worked with them to tell the story a little bit. Is that they wanted to. We came on board to work with them to help show what was the election like. Everyone knew somewhat that there was some shenanigans happening, that maybe it wasn't a totally free and fair election. And the first map that you see here on this site is, if you can't read the legend in the bottom right, it says stations with 600 votes or more to a single candidate. And why this is significant is that most polling stations can't handle more than 600 people per day, based on time going to the queue. These are polling stations, not centers. There's multiple stations within a center. And so these are the amount of across the country where there was significant ballot stuffing happening. And so we were analyzing the data, looking at helping to put them on maps and helping tell a story with NDI about that. And so this was a big big factor in contributing to a runoff, and showing that really kind of helped provide some of that evidence to that.
How soon after the election did you make this?
So this was 2009. I didn't work on this project, but I want to say that at least, so this was a significant effort which was different from 2010, where they released a 2,000-page PDF of all the results. And so I want to say that was maybe 2 to 3 weeks after the election, and at least 4 weeks they had the final results in a 2,000-page PDF. And so then we parsed the PDF multiple times, and that's how this data was kind of opened up and analyzed. And, but that's how they published, the IEC published their data through a PDF, which is awesome.
Yeah.
2010 was a different story. I think they did a Microsoft Access database, but they released it in a period. Like 2 weeks after the election, they released preliminary results, and in 3 weeks they released some more preliminary results, and then 4 weeks they had final results. And that's a different story. So from this. So the story around this is that this was somewhat reactionary. This is after the fact. Nothing really was done before the election around what does, how do we make an election more free and more fair. And so last year, and feel free to pull up any questions. So last year we started, and I know some of you guys have seen some of this work, but we started the Afghanistan Open Data Project, which was this effort to really kind of bring together partners and data before an election. We had this idea that maybe before an election, as we think about data as an infrastructure and think about how do we ask questions, how do we equip journalists, or how do we equip NGOs or observer monitoring groups with data and help them target, help them understand what are the different questions that they can ask before an election, or even like thinking about the IEC and planning, like how are ballot boxes being distributed? Are we looking at when are those ballot boxes being distributed in February when there's a lot of snow? Like, what are these factors? And so opening that data like allows really kind of bring the data to light and think about data before an election. Kind of this like not always just using data reactively, but being proactive with the data. And so the Afghanistan Data Project is just a list of maps, and this is kind of this growing project that we're working on, is how we start analyzing things like extent of snow cover, and what does that mean for polling centers, or are we looking at, what were the polling centers not reporting votes back in 2009, and should we be watching those polling centers in 2010, and so how do we target certain areas of the country that maybe historically have had voter fraud and things like that. So we're also asking questions like, I'll get to this later, but like there's voter registration, and where were those placed, and are they placed in convenient places to allow everyone to register to vote, because you have to register to vote in Afghanistan, and so if you haven't registered, you can't vote on election day. And so there's some interesting ways to look at this. So this is one map, female polling stations available in 2014. This is a fairly interesting map because it's very high level, it's provincial, but it kind of gives you a sense of looking, across the country, what is, how are polling stations being set up within, across the country. In 2009, this is a map of 2009, looking at electoral complaints, so alleged irregularities. So you can see hotspots where there were some higher rates. This is looking at not necessarily 10.7 isn't the amount, but it's per every 10 polling centers. So kind of this normalized rate across the country to see what were the amount of irregularities being reported across the country.
Could you try and break that data down in any way? In other words, people that are in urban areas more likely to complain than people in rural areas, so it's not just about the number of violations, but it has to do with also with whether or not people are more prone to complain.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. This data was aggregated to the province, and so it's, and this is the ECC, and they, I don't know if they're collecting that kind of.
Right. I guess
but
what
you
I
could
mean
look at
is not so much as it's being collected, but people who are ultimately using it, whether it be NDI or others, were they trying to kind of nuance the data a little bit more with something other than just one variable?
Yes. No, we haven't done any of that. I don't know if NDI has done that. But those are the type of questions that I think are more interesting than just looking at rates, but looking at kind of breaking those down, stratifying by urban, rural, and getting a better sense of what does that mean.
Right.
So this year, we've been working with. So this is
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I
Oh, sorry.
just ask a quick question? Do you know kind of what uses it had in 2010? You know, who was using it? Were community organisations using it as well as the sort of international organisations? And were any individuals using it?
Yeah, the old site, the
Yeah.
9/7.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not familiar. So what they were using it as is a tool to really document the election and show. Really, you know, their task to be an election observer, and so they were using that as somewhat of a documentation share, kind of how they, you know, how the election went. So really, that was targeted towards international community, and the purpose of the site was more about documenting the election and less about using the data, you know, after the fact. And so, but the Afghanistan Open Data Project, that's like kind of what we were gearing towards, was equipping people to either take the map or use the map to generate ideas or stories or, you know, understand what should we be asking about our programs, or what does this mean if this number in this area, what does this mean for us as we look to prepare for the election. But I don't know of any stories yet. Yeah, so and we really just put this out, and we had a few partners that were on board for this last year, and you know, so that have since not participated, you know, in the early part of this year, and so we kind of just put this out ourselves, kind of float it out there, see if anyone is interested in picking it up, helping contribute it. Like ultimately, it's not going to benefit from just us Development Seed running this whole project from DC. What we would ideally like to see someone pick it up on the ground and kind of run with it and run with the message around open data, you know, for elections, but also open data in general.
Right.
I have a kind of similar follow-up. I'm just wondering, from the team perspective, what would the numbers be considered for like a successful project? Because it's been something that's come for us in terms of, well, how many people are really looking at these things, and a lot of these types of projects are not necessarily traditional. So for us, it's been a requirement to explain what are the new metrics of success for something. I'm wondering what you guys consider to be, what would make a project successful in your mind?
Yeah. I mean, like on the one hand, you can gauge a little bit of like initial success based off of, you know, sheer numbers of downloads or numbers of people access the data or look at the site. Like there is some value in understanding that, but I think what we generally see as success is really replication. So taking a, not just replicating the exact project, but some of the methodology. What's the kind of the multiplier effect in some ways of that work, and is that tied to and it's a little bit harder to measure. Like we've been, I guess an example of this is we've been working on a proposal with a group that wanted to build a tool, but they have a network of other offices that would be interested in that as well. But they're focusing on one office and one district in Ghana. And so what they're seeking, some of their success, and what we talked with them is that some of the success is we know that could be replicated in other countries, but the success will be seen if other countries start picking it up. If we do this right, and we do the training, and we do implementation right, then success is when other groups are picking that up and implementing it as well. But I don't know. I don't know. I'd be curious of how you guys have approached.
Yeah.
Talked about it.
I mean, of course, there's page views, and then there's the new metric of map views, which is a little bit different. But, you know, we actually have had a $500,000 proposal cut down to $50,000 because Ford Foundation said in Amazonia was a failed project because it didn't get the page views. So like there's real financial consequences to people saying, you know, well, what are your page views? What are your page views? So I'm wondering if there's any way that, you know, if DeadSeed is building in, I know you guys have put a lot of effort into analytics, but we get a lot more of the questions like what Mark is saying, like, or, you know, who's using it? Using it for what? And getting much more refined information than just a sheer aggregate number.
Well, do
Yeah.
you have like numbers on like time on site
Yeah.
and like engagement, and are
Yeah.
those showing positive
Yeah.
things that are meaningful to?
I mean, it's like, you know, 3.5 minutes per site, you know, 50,000 views in, you know, 6 weeks. But, yeah, it's
Ultimately,
like,
that's not even going to be enough. Ultimately, people are going to be looking at, you know, what organizations looked at it and then based on that started to build something on it, or that you saw an increase in number of stories that was addressing that and actually referenced the map so you can actually see actions and activities. And so although it's great to be able to refine the numbers more and more with regard to what is being received, it's ultimately what people do with that information that they're going to be asking for, and that's what we have to try and figure out.
Yeah, that's the problem of, you know, I don't know, how do you really evaluate a program? You know, is it the number of jerry cans that you hand out, or is it like how yeah, exactly. So the same thing is happening like, you know, on a website. Yeah, maybe you're not getting the amount of page views that a Facebook or whatever, you know, it's something that's very widely popular, and like, but your audience is very small, and so you got to look at like what is that base population of who you're really reaching out to, and how does that look? You know, and so maybe they're being very excited in how they're interpreting.
I think we have the responsibility to kind of come up with some measures of impact. And it's not that hard, actually. It's just a case of following the story and actually being more kind of deliberate about showing where the information goes and how it was used. And definitely there are ways we can do that, and we should have probably talked about.
One, I mean, I agree with that, and I think that it is pretty key, and I think that very few people are working on that. There's also the other problem that the majority of those platforms, you basically put the data out, and unless people are proactively coming back to you to tell you, I'm taking this data, I'm using it in this way, they may be already using it in multiple ways that we don't know. When I did the project in Egypt, with Freedom House, and we did like, you know, electoral monitoring system, there were like 2,700 reports of different violations during the parliamentary elections, and we figured out a year and a half later that 150 of those reports were actually being used in Egyptian courts to support trials against, you know, the Electoral Commission. But we discovered completely by chance because someone that was working with us then ended up, you know, working with other people, and then he kind of like came back to us and say, hey, you know, I'm finding a lot of data that is actually coming from the platform. And the other thing was that the data was being replicated and was also being taken by multiple sources. So they may not be taking the data specifically from that platform, but they were using that specific piece of data that was, you know, that we had taken from another source. And so it's like the ecosystem is complex.
Yeah.
Because when you basically put it out there, it's hard to try. I mean, you put it out there because you want people to use it, but then the moment in which you do it, it becomes really hard to track who's actually using it and how are they using it.
I mean, I do think, not to take this conversation any longer, that's absolutely right, and that there's a lot that you're not going to see. I do think that one of the things that we can do is start to think about how wide we can spread a web, you know, with regard to capturing things. What are some of the outcomes where we might actually be able to capture it later? And this is a good example in coming up with courts. But another thing, and one of the things that we're looking at, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this, is having your platforms much more immediately interactive, so that you can grab any opportunity possible where someone starts to use that data. You take that opportunity to reach out to them, establish some contact, and see if through that link you might eventually be able to track it. But it's never going to be a perfect system.
Yeah, yeah. And so if you have data, you can track, number of downloads of a certain data set, but you might also want to follow up. You never want to. I wouldn't recommend requiring a form to fill out before you download the data. I don't recommend that, but immediately after they download, maybe they get some type of message or an opportunity for them to say, either leave feedback or leave, like, here's how we're going to be using the data, or leave us your email and we'll check in later on how you're using this data, something like that, like where there's this, so you have your number of downloads, but then you get a few responses, and you're able to say, all right, based on these few responses, these number of downloads, have been using it for this reason, and something like that could be done to, like, you get a sense of who's downloading for, and wants to give some feedback. But all right, we'll keep going. So back up to so this year. So this was part of, like, the pre-election work, and so then also we've been working with NDI this spring to relaunch their 2014 version of the site, and so they're doing a pre-election site that hasn't fully launched yet, but will be in the next week or so. But this is like a sneak peek of this work that we've been doing for the last couple of weeks. But they're going to put online observer deployment, be able to show who's doing what where, so all the different groups, FIFA, TIFA, these monitoring groups. What's the breakdown of who's doing what in what district? Yeah, and these are planned deployments. These are where people are planning to be across Afghanistan on election day. And then they're looking at polling centers as well. So both showing total numbers of polling centers per district, showing the number of centers and the gender breakdown of each station. And then, but then also just last week, the IEC, the Elections Commission, released all 6,775 polling center locations, which is incredible that they did that before the election. And so now, we can zoom into something like a place like Herat and see across town where the individual centers are going to be placed. And so this is like where somewhat the rubber meets the road, where these are the exciting pieces of data where you can start correlating with, because they will report numbers based on polling center. And so now we get this sense of, can we do some analysis around security and civilians around it, within a kilometer of that polling center, and what would be can we get a sense of what's the impact on voter turnout for that individual center, or for the host, for the 10 centers around that area, and look at numbers of votes for that individual polling center, and kind of get a sense of what's the population around there. I think it creates some unique opportunities to have a little bit more rich analysis of the data. Then the last piece on their site is a kind of this map, slider map that allows you to slide back and forth and look at the numbers of polling centers and numbers of observers, and kind of get the sense of what's the coverage, like, of people. Are there enough observers out there to really have a meaningful sense of transparency at the polling centers. But to go back to the kind of pre-election work and individual data, so from this, all this work, we've been kind of playing around with a couple ideas around analyzing some of the data. Like this is one that I just did recently around looking at population centroids and voter registration spots. And like, I did a quick analysis showing that like 30% of the population was not even within 10 kilometers of voter registration. And like that's significant like access issues around how to, are people in convenient, are voter registration locations in convenient places for people to actually go and register. And so there's interesting view around that. And then this is polling center data and looking at like population density. And this is a world, I don't know if you guys are familiar with World Pop, but it's like a global 100 meter raster data set that's showing population density around the world, and this is Afghanistan. It shows where polling centers are located, and this is shaded on population density. And so we can kind of dive into like a place like Kabul and see population density across the city. And so we haven't really analyzed this much yet, but these are like we're starting to generate some of these questions, and because there's data available now and before the election, so we can say, I have one interesting question around polling centers and population is like, are they going to, is it going to handle the amount of population that's around there, or if it's in a very remote place and it received 10,000 votes, is there an issue there? Right? Is there a voter fraud happening because there's not a lot of people that live in that area, and there's some ballot stuffing happening? So there's a chance to get a sense of that. So that's a little bit of that's the end of my slides. And so I don't know if it's worthwhile to like talk a little bit of some of the tools that we've used to do some of this stuff, or dive into some more of the questions about data, about the strategy of using, the sites we built. Kind of curious of what you guys would be interested in. How will we talk about some of the tools?
Yeah.
Some of our approach.
That'd be helpful.
So, DJ, would you be interested in kind of walking through some of the data, kind of our workflow of what we've been dealing with, kind of like how our workflow has been working with groups like NDI or getting data from other sources, and how we've been going from a spreadsheet or a PDF to a map.
Yeah, that kind of process. That's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so for these, it was pretty straightforward. We, with polling center locations, we actually scraped it out of an API. We made an API call, we took all of the data that was returned to your browser, put it all together into a spreadsheet, I think. Mm-hmm. And then TileMill is really friendly with data. So TileMill is a mapping program that we use, and Mapbox created TileMill to make something as simple as all the dot renderings. So you see a lot of maps now are moving towards doing things in the browser, which means that it's all happening, inside of Chrome, as opposed to someone doing the processing beforehand and uploading a map. But in the case of very dense data, such as beyond maybe 10,000 points, we like to do this still in TileMill because it makes it much faster. So all of this is ready to be loaded immediately. It's already exists on a server. So we're still using TileMill. And also the second reason to do that is because in low bandwidth environments, we have an even slower browser. So if we're seeing problems and delays in our browsers here, it's going to be that much worse in low bandwidth environments. Yeah. So we use TileMill, which is a very simple tool. It's still enough of a learning curve in a tool like TileMill or in the mapping world in general that it's, I think, really important that teams have one person who can dedicate their time to learning and exporting maps. It isn't something that I would say somebody with a full stack of work can just, put into the day to be realistic. So, yeah, I think it's important to say, we're not just going to say, oh, anybody can do this, and anyone can do it, but not anybody has 3 hours to learn every day. So we definitely encourage there to be that data person, and maybe you already have someone in your team who could do that, so that's where development seed comes in. But yeah, quite simply, it's spreadsheets, TileMill, sometimes some SQL, pretty basic data happening here.
Yeah, I think our typical workflow, in the case of, let's go back to,
Also, if you guys have questions, too, John.
yeah.
I have a question. Actually, like, at the very beginning of the process, do you guys ever make a judgment about the quality of the data? And, based on how updated it is or where it came from, or just generally, like, is there a standard that you use to say, okay, this is something that we're going to put up on our platform, or it's toss it out?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So, like, our general workflow is we're either getting data from a partner that we're working with, and that's either in a PDF or a spreadsheet form, or we're going out and looking for data, and then that may be in a PDF or a spreadsheet form. And so from that, we then are looking at the data, kind of getting a sense of what this data is. So in some ways, if we are not very familiar with the data, then we're doing a little bit of exploration around it. Like, are there multiple ways that someone's spelling a certain name? Is there a lot of missing data for a column that a data field that we'd like to use? And what's that going to mean for how we look at it on a map? Or we're looking at like in the case of this observer deployment, it was a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet with 30 tabs, and so we have to get the sense of, okay, how do we start to combine all these spreadsheets together into this like single flat file that we can start working with? And in the case of like PDF, so sometimes like country statistics agencies report all their statistics in PDF form, but they can be scraped out, and and like so I guess to go back to your question, I think we try and put a little bit emphasis on understanding the data to make a call on the data, but that call is also very much based on like how do we envision using that data, and so if it's and so we can't really envision how to use it until we've really looked at it and say, okay, we can use this to look at observer deployment by district, or we really the only meaningful view that we can get is by province, because there's so much other lacking data that we can aggregate and still have this meaningful view. I think that's kind of our approach there. So then from there, that initial exploration, we're then doing, we may need to do some cleaning of like organizing names, making sure that if there are some discrepancies that we fix those. And then what we're doing a lot is trying to build that in a very automated way. It's easy to do it in a manual way and just like save your spreadsheet, but sometimes if there's updated data comes in, we want to just, what we do is we work a lot in Python to do any of our data processing, and so it's a tool that we use to build a custom script that just pulls down data, fixes any errors, and then kicks out our clean spreadsheet. There's other ways of doing that. There's manual ways. There's ways to document just your steps that you did in manipulating the spreadsheet and then saving it. But we try and go the automated route.
I'm interested to hear how many of you guys work with data on like a daily basis or a weekly basis? 1, 2. Okay. And are there any, I guess then when you guys have data challenges, does it go off it goes either to you guys or to other people on your team?
It depends what the project, I think not everybody's project are touching data, so the people who are really like deeply in it all the time.
I have a question actually. You mentioned Python and other tools. Do they do like consistency checks to check like the data kind of provenance to make sure that it's kind of, you know, not being faked or not being miscoded or whatever? Because, you know, in past when I've dealt with data, we need to do a lot of internal consistency checks to make sure certain interviewers or people are collecting data are not kind of just making stuff up.
Yeah.
It's amazing how often that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so in a tool like Python, you would be able to create that and customize that for that certain problem. So if you did have, let's say, you know, thousands of surveys that someone had done, you know, household surveys or whatever, and you were aggregating that in an automated manner, you could add in some checks. Like, I think it's really interesting, like, where if you look at, like, there's some cool stuff around, like, groups like FormHub or, you know, tools like that where they're adding timestamps into, like, your survey when they actually entered in the data. It's not a manual entry, you know, so it's collected when they enter the data, hit submit, and so there's interesting ways that you can analyze that to get a sense of, did someone just spend 5 minutes and enter in 100 forms, or did they enter in over the course of the day? And so adding in some of those checks allows that.
Yeah, it's definitely easier if it's electronically entered.
Yeah.
I have another question actually, which is about other data sets that you could bring into this.
Yep.
Do you bring in any kind of other kind of data from like demographic or infrastructural data or other stuff that you can layer on this to kind of give
Yeah, we have looked at some, like the extent of snow cover by month. We looked at like settlement locations, so that's like population centroids. So we are pulling, like, we've been, the Afghanistan Open Data Project has been very much centered on questions around elections. You know, so if there is a certain question that involves, you know, demographics or poverty or some other indicator that helps, you know, kind of ask that question, that's where I think it kind of comes into that.
Right,
yeah. To go back to your question around, like, crowdsourcing geographic data, and not just like a report or a data point, but so what he's talking about in some ways, some of it is sending someone to OpenStreetMap and like, hey, go to OpenStreetMap, edit it, you're going to see it on the map here when you come back. Or there's other ways of, so if you're going to, so like GeoJSON.io is just an example, but basically it's using the leaflet draw, which is like the library behind this, but being able to have someone log in and say, all right, this is an area that I'm really concerned about, and I'm going to say, you know, name, you know, problem area 1, and, you know, save that. And in effect, like, you're allowing someone to draw within the application, save it, and then send it to a certain location. Then you're like collecting that data. Someone else who's logging in is able to see this point and be like, great, this looks right, but, you know, let's add a type because I know this area and it's, you know, whatever. That's kind of the very interesting thing, is where one person can create, you know, some geographic data, then another person can log in, edit it, change it, augment it. So it's a little bit like OpenStreetMap, but it's very focused around certain type of data or certain functionality, and not necessarily data that needs to be in OpenStreetMap.